Chapter 1502. Harris listened to Meg explain all kinds of spices that he had never heard of before. He wasn't asking questions, but was really like a serious student. Of course, what surprised him the most was that he had almost traveled all over the Norland continent and seen all kinds of spices used by different races. However, there were still many spices that he had never heard of before that Meg was talking about. For example, the spice called star anise. According to Meg, it was produced in the mountains near Isen Castle. However, he had never seen a chef using this spice in the 20 years that he had stayed in Isen Castle. There was also the cinnamon. It was a kind of tree bark that had a unique fragrance. This method of obtaining spices made him very surprised. "Master, I'm afraid there isn't a single market on the Norland continent that can find all of these spices that you need," Harris complained after hearing Meg's explanation. "That's indeed the case. I also obtained some of the spices through special channels. They haven't been widely accepted and promoted." Meg nodded in agreement. Some of the spices didn't exist in this world, and were cultivated by the system. "In this case, we won't be able to replicate this dish if we leave Chaos City." Harris scratched his head with a frown. He was a little frustrated. "I will give you a set of spices when you leave. If you finish it, you can come back to get more," Meg said to Harris earnestly. "As the saying goes, don't travel too far when your master is around." Chapman hesitated for a while, and softly asked, "Great master, don't we not travel too far when our parents are around?" Harris couldn't help but give him a sideways glance. He was obviously taking advantage of him. "That's roughly what it means." Meg nodded calmly, and continued, "Knowing the spices is only the first step. Next, we have to talk about how to braise it. This is a step to let the beef and beef offal absorb the spices perfectly. It's also the most important step in the dish, husband and wife lung slice. A pot of premium braising sauce can give the meat a soul, and these spices are the real main characters." Meg continued to explain. He set up a wok and began to demonstrate the operation of the wok. As a veteran chef with decades of experience, these steps were extremely simple for Harris. To him, what he learned was more about Meg's understanding and application of spices. If he could add a large number of spices together, it would create a more wonderful taste instead of restricting and affecting each other. Chapman, on the other hand, was a very honest and good student. He remembered every step that Meg explained in detail. At the same time, he wrote down the key points in his notebook, just like a student who leaned forward to listen to the teacher. After the plate presentation is done, pour the freshly boiled chili oil over it slowly, sprinkle a handful of cooked sesame seeds, and add some tender green coriander as decoration. Then, the delicious husband and wife lung slice will be done. Meg took a step back and displayed the husband and wife lung slice that he had just made. It's a combination of color and aroma. It's so complicated that it's astonishing. Every step has a genius idea. "Master, you're really a genius," Harris complimented. The steps of boiling the chili oil previously also amazed him. He didn't expect that oil could be processed like this, and become something like a condiment. This completely overturned some of his fixed thinking. "It's just a routine operation." Meg waved his hand nonchalantly, and passed 2 pairs of chopsticks to Harris and Chapman. He said, "Here, try it. You didn't get to eat this dish yesterday, either. Let me try this beef first." Harris took the chopsticks, and picked up a thin piece of beef that was covered in the translucent chili oil. The aroma of the braised meat and chili oil wafted over slowly. Before it entered his mouth, he already couldn't help but salivate. When the beef entered his mouth, there was a hint of chewiness amidst its softness. It wasn't the kind that would melt in his mouth. The aroma of the meat blossomed slowly as he chewed, and exploded into a deliciousness that made his taste buds go crazy under the influence of the chili oil. This taste. Harris' eyes lit up immediately. This taste was simply too impactful. The various spices weren't stacked on top of each other for no reason. Every single one of them was emitting a unique fragrance, making the taste of this mouthful of meat extremely layered. The rich aroma exploded in his mouth, and was intoxicating. Slash. With a crisp sound, the cotton robe that Harris was wearing actually tore open. This dish has actually reached the level of making Master's robe tear open. Chapman looked at Harris' torn robe in shock. He had followed his master for many years, and had only seen such a situation 2 or 3 times. Does this dish really have such magical powers? Chapman picked up his chopsticks expectantly, picked up a piece of beef scalp, and put it into his mouth. The soft and sticky beef scalp didn't have the toughness of the leather at all, and was easily torn open by his teeth. The beef scalp, which was the most difficult to taste, still had a rich spicy aroma after being braised for a long time. The plump collagen gave it a sticky texture, but the fragrance of the braised meat neutralized the stickiness perfectly, and brought about a very wonderful texture. Meanwhile, the chili oil on the outside gave the beef scalp a fragrant and spicy taste. So this is the taste. Chapman's eyes lit up. The taste of this beef scalp was completely beyond his imagination. The rich and wonderful taste made him understand the complicated process from before, and that every spice had its own unique effect. I feel that yesterday's competition was a little unfair, Harris said seriously to Meg. Meg looked at him. Is he trying to deny it? This should be a 5 o'clock round. My 18-year-old maiden dress is obviously a crazy crush in terms of taste, alright? There's no comparison at all. 1 is simply a blasphemy to the husband and wife lung slice, Harris said agitatedly. Meg didn't know how to continue all of a sudden. He smiled, and said, alright, I'll stop explaining this dish here. The restaurant has all the ingredients and kitchenware you need. You can practice on your own, and you can ask me if there's anything you don't understand. Harris nodded. Then, his gaze landed on Chapman, and he smilingly said, take it slow. Why don't we make a serving of husband and wife lung slice at the same time and see whose is better? I'm slow-witted. I don't dare to compare myself with Master. Chapman shook his head. It's all right. I know you're slow-witted and slow to learn things. Otherwise, why would I pick you? Harris chuckled, and said, this won't affect my performance. Chapman was still a little hesitant. Don't worry. Let Great Master give you some pointers. Meg looked at Chapman with a smile, and then stuck out his middle finger at him. Bookhouse Reading Website. Chapter 1503. I have a golden finger. I don't know where to tap. Meg pretended to be profound as he chanted a rather embarrassing incantation. Then, he tapped on Chapman's glabella lightly. His finger only touched the glabella for less than a second. Meg took a step back. Meanwhile, Chapman closed his eyes. Chapman felt a mysterious force surging into his mind. Every step that Meg did and every sentence that he said started to appear in his mind. Some things that he didn't understand before were solved instantly, and became easy to understand. After a while, he opened his eyes slowly as if he had understood everything. Have you memorized it? Meg asked with a smile. Millimeterham, I've memorized it all. Chapman nodded. He looked at Meg with surprise and admiration. He really couldn't understand how Meg could understand this dish so thoroughly just by tapping on his glabella lightly. It was as if he had cooked it many times. You really memorized it all? Harris looked at Chapman doubtfully. This eldest disciple of his was good at everything, but he was a slow learner. Not only did he have a slow start, but he also ran slowly. The only praiseworthy thing about him was his stability. Yes, Master. Chapman nodded again. Harris knew that Chapman was never good at lying. He couldn't help but look at Meg's finger suspiciously. Could this really be some kind of golden finger? He learned it just by tapping on it a little. However, as his master, he naturally couldn't back down at this time. He smiled, and said, all right. Since this is the case, let's have a culinary duel today. The husband and wife lung slice will be the duel. My master will be the judge. Let's see whose dish is better. Yes. Chapman nodded respectfully, and didn't reject any more. Since this is the case, let me be the judge for this duel between the master and disciple. First, I will definitely not let my emotions affect my decisions. Second, I will definitely not miss out on any bad thing. Third, I will definitely be fair and beautiful as the judge. Judge Meg, come in. I will be the judge for this duel. Meg raised his hand, but the merry-go-round didn't start. He had no choice but to withdraw his hand awkwardly, and take 2 steps back to give Harris and his disciple the stage. Duel, start. Master is indeed professional. Harris and Chapman were a little surprised. After hearing that the duel had started, they started to enter cooking mode. The first step was to prepare the ingredients. Choose the spices needed for the braise from the hundreds of spice boxes. That would test if they were serious about the lecture and how much they knew about the spices. Harris looked at the spice box and fell into deep thought. He had remembered everything with his eyes earlier, but he couldn't really recall which box Mag took the spices from. After pondering seriously for a while, he picked out a few spices with obvious characteristics, such as star anise. He could only rely on his sense of smell to identify the rest. On the other hand, Chapman was casually grabbing various spices from the spice box and throwing them into the pot one by one. His movements were skillful and casual, as if he had a plan in mind. Harris turned around to see that Chapman had already finished selecting the ingredients and was preparing the beef and beef offal. After hesitating for a while, Harris stuck his head out to take a peek. Warning for peeking. Meg's stern voice sounded. Hee hee. I just want to see if this chap is fooling around. Harris retracted his head and laughed awkwardly. Meg was expressionless, but his eyes were fixed on Chapman. He also wanted to know how effective this golden finger was, and if it could really point anywhere. Harris used his sense of smell to pick the spices. Although he was a little slower, he still chose the spices that he needed accurately. However, by the time he was done, Chapman had already put the meat into the braise pot and started to braise it. Sigh. His start is not slow at all this time. In fact, it's shockingly fast. Harris was a little surprised. He was even more curious about what Meg gave Chapman. It actually had such a miraculous effect. Or could it be that Master secretly tutored his disciple's disciple behind his disciple's back? Another thought popped up in Harris' mind, but he quickly eliminated it. They didn't have the time to commit the crime. I didn't expect that there would be a day where I would need to be serious when facing Man. Harris sighed, and a serious expression also appeared on his face. He carefully recalled Meg's cooking process, and began to cook according to it. Meg stood at the side and watched quietly. He observed the details of the two of them cooking, but didn't point out or correct them. He could tell that Chapman, who had been instructed by him, had done the details very well. His understanding of the dish husband and wife lung slice was obviously very deep. Meanwhile, Harris also displayed strong comprehension and execution with his superb knife skills and decades of experience as a chef. The details were impeccable. However, he had only seen Meg's operation and explanation once, so he would pause at some steps. Man, let me take a look at your notes, Harris said to Chapman. Harris said to Chapman, and explained calmly, I didn't forget. I just wanted to confirm it a little. This is the most basic serious attitude of a chef. You have to learn it. Yes, Master. Chapman passed the notebook to Harris with a look of being taught. Meg's lips twitched. Who would believe you? Old man, you're very bad. This red oil needs to be added first, and then this. Harris flipped through Chapman's notebook seriously. On the other side, Chapman had already poured the boiled red oil into a big bowl. About half an hour later, Harris poured the boiled red oil onto the thinly sliced beef and beef offal, and a serving of red husband and wife lung slice was completed. On the other side, Chapman had already finished a few minutes earlier. Harris took a look at the husband and wife lung slice that Chapman made. The style was basically the same as his. After all, Chapman was a disciple that he brought up. He had a strong drive, and his knife skills that had been honed for close to 20 years were only slightly worse than his. Why do I feel a little nervous? This shouldn't be. Harris raised his eyebrows slightly as he felt his heart start to race. It was fine if he lost to Meg. After all, there was always someone better than him. However, if he lost to a disciple that he brought up himself, that feeling would be a little strange. The cooking is over. Now, let's enter the tasting and judging segment. Meg snapped his fingers and gestured for the two contestants to bring their respective husband and wife lung slice forward. From the looks of it, There was almost no difference between the 2 servings of husband and wife lung slice. The exquisite knife skills allowed the thickness of every slice of meat to be very uniform. They spun and spread out on the plate like a blooming flower. What made Meg a little surprised was Chapman's knife skills. He looked a little dull, but his knife skills were extremely exquisite. He was only slightly worse than Harris, and his overall standard should be above Harris. "Let me try." Meg picked up a pair of chopsticks, and picked up a piece of beef from Harris' plate. Chapter 1504. The thin beef was wrapped in a layer of crystal-clear chili oil. As he got closer, the spicy aroma of the chili oil wafted over. Judging from the color, it was bright red and glossy. Smelling the aroma, it was spicy but not pungent. The appearance and aroma had basically met the basic requirements of husband and wife lung slice. Then, he put it into his mouth. The beef was soft and tender, and melted in his mouth with a gentle bite. The spicy aroma bloomed in his mouth, and intertwined with the aroma of the beef. It was indeed delicious. However, Meg's brows furrowed slightly. After pondering for a while, he picked up a piece of tripe and put it into his mouth. The tripe was still considered crispy, but there were some parts that were hard to chew and swallow after chewing. Meg was deep in thought, and roughly determined where the problem was. Harris looked at Meg nervously as he waited for his comments. However, Meg put down his chopsticks, and didn't comment directly. Instead, he rinsed his mouth carefully with mouthwash, changed to a clean pair of chopsticks, and picked up a piece of beef as well. From the appearance, it didn't look much different from Harris, but the aroma of the chili oil was richer. After putting the beef into his mouth, he chewed it gently. The tender texture gave him a refreshing feeling, while the aroma of the beef, the spiciness of the braised meat, and the spiciness of the chili oil exploded in his mouth, bringing about a surprising texture and a wonderful taste. Meg nodded. This was the correct taste. It was tender and not soft and tender. It looked similar, but the texture and taste in his mouth were completely different. What determined all of this was the control of the heat. The aroma of the chili oil was also richer than Harris. The taste of the chili and other spices had been completely boiled into the chili oil. Then, Meg picked up a piece of tripe and put it into his mouth. The crispy texture brought him a wonderful enjoyment in his mouth. It was crispy and tender, and there was no situation where it couldn't be chewed. It was obvious who was better. Harris's husband and wife lung slice is already at its peak. The steps and process of cooking are also not wrong. It's just that he wasn't familiar with the spices and ingredients, and was unfamiliar with the cooking method. This led to the inconsistency of the cooking process, and affected the final product of the husband and wife lung slice. The beef was too soft and tender, and it melted in the mouth immediately. One couldn't enjoy the rich aroma of chewing the beef. The tripe was a little overripe. It was crispy but not tender. At the same time, there was a part of it that couldn't be chewed, which greatly affected the taste and texture of the tripe. Meg smiled at Harris, and said to him, "This is your first time cooking husband and wife lung slice. You're really outstanding to be able to do this. Master, you flatter me." Harris smiled humbly, and his expression gradually became smug. He had expected that there would be some problems with the control of the fire. After all, it was his first time, and he didn't know much about the cooking method and ingredients. It was indeed not bad to be able to replicate it as completely as possible. Mag continued to look at Chapman, and said, however, in comparison, Chapman's husband and wife lung slice has already reached a rather high standard. Regardless of whether it's the boiling of the chili oil or the braising of the beef and beef offal, they have all shown his understanding of this dish. Moreover, in terms of the control of the fire, he had a perfect grasp of the rhythm. The tender and dregs of beef and the crispy and bouncy tripe of beef perfectly displayed the essence and deliciousness of the husband and wife lung slice. To be able to produce such a level of husband and wife lung slice on his first try, he is worthy of being called a genius. The smile on Harris' face gradually froze, and he suddenly felt that something was amiss. There was a huge gap between being outstanding and being a genius. He had never thought that these two words would be used on him and Chapman one day. Furthermore, he was the outstanding one, while Chapman was the genius. Therefore, for this duel of husband and wife lung slice, I chose Chapman's husband and wife lung slice. Meg raised his finger and pointed at Chapman. It can't be. Harris' expression collapsed. Such a thing actually happened. One had to know that Chapman was indeed a very slow learner. Every time Harris taught him a new dish, he would need at least a month to master it. However, he actually managed to master it after watching Meg's demonstration and explanation just once today. This wasn't Chapman at all. Chapman hurriedly shook his head and said, I am slow-witted. It is all thanks to great master's guidance that I can understand and comprehend the husband and wife lung slice so quickly. I dare not say that I can win against master. Let me try it, too. Harris was still a little unconvinced. He picked up his chopsticks and picked up a piece of beef that he had made. Just like what Meg had said, the beef was too soft, and there was almost no texture. It had lost the original taste of beef. This terrible texture. Harris frowned. The problem with the heat control was indeed very serious. It had completely lost the original taste that he should have. He then picked up a piece of beef that Chapman had made and put it into his mouth. The tender texture, together with the spicy chili oil, the fragrance of the braised meat, and the more he chewed, the more fragrant it became. It gave him a double pleasure of chewing and tasting. I suspect that you have been acting as me all this while. After a long while, Harris put down his chopsticks silently and looked at Chapman with a complicated expression. Chapman was sweating and didn't know how to continue the conversation. Harris then heaved a long sigh of relief and rejoiced. Luckily, I calmed down just now and didn't bet on another master. Compared to these 2 servings of husband and wife lung slice, this one that I made is indeed completely crushed. The difference is not only in the control of the details, but also in the understanding of this dish, Harris said frankly. However, he still looked at Meg curiously. Master, how did you enlighten this blockhead? This is something that I haven't been able to do after over 20 years of hard work. Look. Meg slowly raised his middle finger. This is the legendary golden finger. I know where to point. Harris looked at Meg's raised middle finger. Although he felt that something was amiss, he still couldn't help but beg out of curiosity. Then, can you point at me too? All right, let me give you some pointers. Meg nodded and raised his middle finger at Harris Glabella with a serious expression. Tilda, shut up. Don't make such strange sounds. Tilda. Meg retracted his finger and took 2 steps back. Meanwhile, Harris still had his eyes closed. His eyebrows were slightly raised, and his expression was rather interesting. The messy information about the husband and wife lung slice in his mind seemed to have been directed by this finger, and was quickly organized into information that he could accept easily. Some of the questions that he didn't understand previously were also solved. This is too magical. After about 3 minutes, Harris opened his eyes and looked at Meg in amazement. You really know how to point at everything. You know everything. Master, you are really a genius at being a teacher. Meg shook his head and humbly said, it's just a small trick. I'm actually not good at being a teacher at all. Love. Chapter 1505. In the tea room, Bennett lifted the lid of the teapot and put some tea leaves inside. He closed the lid again and continued to boil the tea. Boss, 2 orcs got into a fight at the gambling den in the West City today. One of them died, and the other one is being held captive by our brothers. What should we do? A burly man with a stocky build walked in quickly and spoke to Bennett in a low voice. A life for a life. Same old rules. Dig a hole in the backyard and bury him, Bennett said calmly as he added 2 pieces of charcoal to the stove. Yes, that burly man replied, and turned to walk towards the door. Wait a minute. Bennett suddenly spoke up. He looked at the burly man who had turned around in confusion, and said, do things cleanly these days. All right, the burly man replied, and walked away quickly. Am I becoming more and more timid? Bennett laughed self-deprecatingly. He recalled what Meg said in the morning. If this happened 10 years ago, he could make sure Meg wouldn't be able to walk out of this door. However, Meg's identity was a little special. Not only was his daughter the disciple of 2 great magic casters, But he was also very famous in Chaos City now. If anything happened to him, he would be in trouble. Of course, this didn't mean that he had to tolerate it. He had just sent out a few letters, and there would be people coming from different places in a few days. It would be easier for them to handle some things. He was just a chef, and he dared to talk big in front of him. If he didn't teach him a lesson, his reputation in Chaos City wouldn't be so useful in the future. Bennett tilted his head to look at the dark night sky outside the window, and curled his lips slightly. His men should be teaching that old lady a lesson now. He was very displeased with Rena's insubordination, so she had to pay the price for her actions. 3 black figures approached the dormitory under the cover of the night. The 3 of them looked at each other in the dark. One of them pointed upstairs, and the 3 of them went up the stairs to the dormitory. One of them reached out to knock on the door, while the other 2 grabbed the hemp rope and wooden stick in their hands. Bang, bang, bang. Before they could knock on the door, 3 muffled thuds were heard. 3 members of the Grey Temple dragged the 3 unconscious men away, and soon disappeared into the night. Wildcats fighting? After a while, the door of the dormitory opened a crack. Karen's looked around in confusion, muttered, and closed the door again. In the West City Casino, a figure was lying on the roof, watching a group of casino staff dig a big hole in the backyard and throw 2 orcs in. One of them was already dead, and the other was still struggling. However, its mouth was gagged, and its limbs were tied up, so it could only let out a few whimpers. What are you shouting for? If you owe money, you have to pay with your life. This is the rule of our casino. The brothers will help you spend the money you've won. The burly man who was with Bennett earlier said with a sinister smile, causing everyone to laugh along with him. Bury them. Make sure they are clean. The burly man weighed the pouch full of money in his hand and said with a smile, Tonight, I'll be treating. Good wine and beauties won't be left out. All righty. Everyone answered excitedly, and their shoveling movements became much faster. After filling the hole with soil, they casually threw 2 stones on top of it before leaving together. The black figure lying on the roof waited for a while before landing lightly in the yard. It got a bamboo stick from somewhere, and poked a hole in the ground with a wooden stick before inserting the hollow bamboo tube into the ground. Then, it quickly disappeared from the yard. Sir, come in and have some fun. We have a few new Miss Succubus in our yard recently. They know all kinds of tricks. I'm sure they'll serve you well. At the entrance of a brothel with red lanterns in the south of the city, an old woman and a few coquettishly dressed succubi were soliciting men passing by. A wretched-looking demon with sparse hair walked forward frivolously, and said in a low voice, Do you have goods today? The old woman took a look at his bulging money pouch, and immediately put on a charming smile. She held his hand and walked into the building while smiling, and said, Of course. We have everything you want. You have the latest too? The demon asked. Of course. No one in Chaos City has as many as we do, the old woman said with a smile. She reached into her deep cleavage and took out a packet of white powder, and handed it to the demon. Look at the quality. Where can you get it after leaving this yard? Number 1 has entered the enemy's territory. It's confirmed that there's an illegal magic potion trade. Requesting backup. A young man said softly with a conch in his hand behind a big tree a little further away. An invisible net had been set up quietly, but the fish in the net didn't know it yet. After the busy evening business hours, Raina didn't have supper with Meg and the rest. She hurried back to the dormitory, knocked on the door, and saw her mother standing there unscathed. She finally felt relieved. Mother, are you hungry? Do you want me to make you something to eat? Raina asked Karen's with a smile as she closed the door. I'm not hungry. I'm going to sleep soon. What's there to eat? Karen's shook her head with a smile. She looked at Raina with heartache. You must be exhausted after a busy day. Quickly take a bath and go to sleep. I'm not tired at all. I'll go take a bath first. Raina shook her head with a smile, and went into the bathroom with her pajamas. Soaking in the bathtub, Raina recalled what Meg said today, and felt a warmth in her heart. Her fear of that bald man also disappeared quite a bit. This was not the slums, after all, so he shouldn't dare to do anything. The next morning, Bennett was woken up by a series of hurried knocks on the door. "Boss, our gambling dens and brothels were raided last night," a middle-aged manager said to Bennett with a horrified expression as he rushed in. "What?" Bennett jumped up from the bed immediately and glared at him. "What did you say?" "Your gambling den and brothel were raided by the Grey Temple last night, and all of them were arrested. We didn't even have time to send out the news." "What should we do now?" the manager said in a sobbing voice with a worried expression. "How did this happen?" Bennett frowned. He got down from the bed and paced around the room barefooted. He suddenly stopped and looked at the manager. "Did you find out anything?" "No. Our informant at the Grey Temple didn't give us any reply, either. The people we sent to sound them out didn't return." The manager shook his head. Once the Grey Temple made a move, they were no match for them. Could it be him? Bennett immediately thought of Meg's warning, and all of this happened right after his warning. Wonderful Bookhouse. Chapter 1506. Bennett's hands and feet were a little cold. Although he was in a warm room, his back was already drenched in cold sweat. He had risen from the bottom, and his status in Chaos City's underground world was supported by the gambling dens and brothels. However, all of them had been seized by the Grey Temple overnight, and all of his employees had been arrested. This was obviously not a surprise inspection that could be avoided. In the past, he had always relied on money to maintain relationships, and he could always make everything seem to be in order before the inspection. However, it was a little different this time. The gambling dens and brothels were all sealed up, and the news was only sent to him this morning. To be able to do all this meant that this was a big operation led by the Grey Temple against him. Bennett couldn't help but think of Meg, the restaurant owner who made a harmless threat at the tea house that day. All these years, he had indeed offended many people to be able to survive in both the underworld and the underworld. However, even his elder brother, who wanted him dead, couldn't do anything to him even though he was the head of the Marquis family. He didn't care about the other small fries at all. If it was Meg, how could a small restaurant owner like him have the ability to influence the Grey Temple to make a move on him? And it was such a large-scale operation. Bennett felt a headache and heartache. Although he had been clearing his name all these years to get himself out of those illegal businesses and become a successful businessman, he still needed to maintain this kind of operation. Take that tea house for example. Although it was known as the best tea house in Chaos City, and served guests of different identities every day, it had been operating at a loss until now. All this money came from the gambling dens and brothels. Although he tried his best to draw a clear line between these two, he had to admit that these things were indeed his most precious things. Losing these two things meant that he had lost his source of income. It was as if he had lost everything. Have the gambling dens and brothels completely severed their ties with me? Bennett asked that manager. Yes. Apart from a few trustworthy people, no one else knows that these gambling dens and brothels belong to you. That manager quickly nodded. They've been arrested too. Bennett frowned. Don't worry, they are very tight-lipped. They know the consequences of betraying you, so they definitely won't reveal you. The steward patted his chest and promised. Bennett heaved a sigh of relief. As long as he was not implicated, there was still room for negotiation. He said in a low voice, "Go and find out more about the situation. Be careful, don't get yourself involved." Yes. The supervisor left in a hurry. So be it if the casino is gone. At least I'm still a member of the Marquis family. As long as the hot pot restaurant can open successfully, I'll snatch the position of the patriarch from Bowen's hands sooner or later. The Marquis family should be inherited by me, Bennett muttered to himself in a low voice as he clenched his fists slowly. In the gloomy dungeon, there were all kinds of torture instruments hanging on the walls. Screams came from all over the prison cells, accompanied by the crisp and clear sounds of whips. "Boss, those tight-lipped ones have been pried open. The boss behind these gambling dens and brothels is Bennett Marquis." Over 50 corpses were dug out from the backyard of the gambling dens. Most of them were gamblers who caused trouble at the gambling dens or gamblers who won quite a bit of money from the gambling dens. The brothels also seized a large batch of illegal magic potions. Last night, We followed the clues to their pharmaceutical base and caught a batch of poison magic casters. The boss behind this is also Bennett. A member of the Grey Temple's intelligence department walked into Burton's office with a thick stack of confessions. He placed the confessions on Burton's desk and proudly said, "How can there be a mouth that our intelligence department can't pry open? This is really a big fish. If I didn't investigate, I wouldn't have known that there was such a ruthless person hiding in Chaos City. Furthermore, he has almost cleared his name." Burton also picked up the stack of confessions in surprise and flipped through it casually. After that, he looked up at that subordinate and said, "Focus on investigating. Find out who is protecting the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle. I want to see who is the one who is so powerful as to raise such a jackal right under our noses." "Yes." That subordinate closed the door and left. Burton looked at the stack of confessions and pondered for a while before picking them up and walking to the Lord's office. This was a big case, and it was no longer as simple as threatening Meg. He had to ask the Lord for instructions. It involved the interests of all parties, and his authority was probably not enough. However, he was sure of one thing. That illegitimate son of the Marquis family was doomed. In an office of the inspection department, a middle-aged man punched the wall with a gloomy expression and said, "Damn it. The intelligence department got a high-level authority from somewhere and directly went around me to wipe out all of Bennett's gambling dens and brothels. I still don't know what they are investigating, but the intelligence department didn't say anything. They just said that they didn't have enough authority and pushed me back. Captain, what do we do now? Will this matter be traced back to us?" Two men in the inspection department's uniform asked nervously as they wiped their cold sweat. The man who was addressed as the captain retracted his fist and quickly calmed down. He shook his head and said, "Don't panic. Not many people know about this. It was all discussed at Bennett's tea house. As long as Bennett isn't investigated, we will be fine. Moreover, we only got a little bit of this money." The two men heaved a sigh of relief when they heard that. Their eyes lit up when they heard the second half of the sentence. The middle-aged man continued, "However, we have to figure out the reason for this sudden attack. Even if we don't help to bail him out, we have to at least understand the situation so that we can react accordingly. All right, let's go to the intelligence department to find out more." The two men left quickly. The middle-aged man paced around the room and muttered to himself with a grave expression, "This situation has to be reported to that lord. It has to be suppressed. Otherwise, who knows how many people will be implicated." Meg woke up early as usual. He turned off the alarm clock at the bedside and was about to get out of bed when the two little fellows pounced on him. Meow tilde dragon's roar. Meg couldn't help but smile as he looked at the two little fellows who were lying on his left and right and pretending to be fierce. Growl tilde at this moment, the sound of a stomach growling could be heard clearly. "It's the hungry dragon's roar, right? I can hear the sound of a stomach growling," Meg said to Amy with a smile. "Aya, stupid stomach. It's growling by itself." Amy's expression collapsed. She lifted a corner of the blanket and snuggled into Meg's arms. She closed her eyes comfortably. Tilde it's so warm and comfortable tilde meow tilde ugly duckling snuggled into the blanket as well, and lay on Meg's stomach like a soft blanket. "Tell me, what do you want to eat for breakfast?" "Father will make it for you," Meg said with a smile as he looked down at the little fellow's adorable face. Chapter 1507. Me. Amy tilted her head up and thought seriously for a while before saying, "I want to eat rainbow fried rice today." "Beautiful rainbow fried rice. All right, then father will make rainbow fried rice for you later," Meg said with a smile as he lowered his head and kissed Amy's hair gently on her forehead. "It's so ticklish tilde." Amy shrank into Meg's arms and giggled. After breakfast, Meg sent Amy to class on his bicycle. When he passed by the tea house, he slowed down and took a look. It seemed to be no different from usual. The operation hasn't started yet, Meg thought to himself. However, judging from Raina's expression in the morning, she probably hadn't been harassed last night, so he didn't think too much about it. He wasn't worried that the Grey Temple would ignore him. This fellow was problematic. He didn't even need to do anything. As long as the Grey Temple was willing to put in the effort to investigate, they would definitely find him. The most precious thing for a person who worked hard to clear his name was his reputation. What he was most afraid of was the things that he had hidden well being pulled out of the water again. Meg had plenty of ways to deal with this kind of person. If he couldn't get through the Grey Temple, then he could go to the City Lord's castle. There were plenty of platforms and big shots. Amy got off the bicycle at the school gate and asked Meg with anticipation, "Father, we'll be on holiday in a few days. Big sister Anna and I have already rehearsed the performance for the literary gala. Will you and Mother come to watch it?" "Yes, we'll all come." Meg nodded with a smile. Chaos School was going to have its winter break next week. Amy and Anna had spent a lot of time rehearsing for the literary gala. Of course, he wouldn't dare to miss it. As for Irina, he felt that she wouldn't reject it either. "That's great. I love you all." Amy rushed over and hugged Meg, who was bending over. Then, she waved at him and walked into the school. "Good morning, Mr. Meg." Luna had just returned from breakfast. When she saw Meg standing at the school gate looking into the school, she smiled and said, "You're here to send Amy to school, right?" "Good morning, Teacher Luna. I just sent her here." Meg turned around and greeted Luna with a smile. "I don't know if Amy has told you, but we'll be holding a end-of-term party next Friday. We're inviting the children and their parents to attend. Would you be free to come and watch?" Luna looked at Meg and said. She also knew that Mamis was extremely busy, and Meg might not be able to spare the time. "Yes, Amy just told me that I'll be coming to watch the performance. After all, they've been rehearsing for a long time." Meg smiled and nodded. "All right. See you next time. I'll go and prepare for my lesson first." Luna and Meg nodded slightly and walked into the school. Mr. Meg really loved Amy. Even though he was so busy, he was still willing to come and watch the party. But, how should I arrange her identity? Meg rode his bicycle in the direction of the restaurant, but he started to worry about Irina's identity. After all, in the eyes of outsiders, he was Amy's single father. The role of a mother had never appeared in her life. With Irina's identity and fame, she would be the center of attention no matter where she went. If the three of them went together on the day of the party, it would be tantamount to announcing his identity to the world. Although he had been looking forward to the day when the three of them could live together openly, go out shopping together, and play together, he had been looking forward to the day when the three of them could live together openly. But he wasn't strong enough yet. With a 9th-tier power level and super powerful sword skills, his power had already reached the top level of the Norland continent. But the enemies he had to face were too strong. His current power was far from enough to protect Amy and Irina from harm. Once he was exposed, he would attract the attacks of countless enemies. When he was hiding his identity, he was the powerful and invincible dragon-slaying knight Alex. This sense of mystery was enough to deter all enemies. Before his power was fully recovered, he could only continue to hide his identity. Of course, if it wasn't necessary, even if his power was fully recovered in the future, he wanted to continue wearing the mask and appearing as Alex. After taking off the mask, he was the boss of Amy's, Meg. He didn't want customers to come from afar one day just to taste the dishes cooked by the best knight in the world, but because they heard that the boss of this restaurant cooked very well. "Seems like I still have to find a suitable identity for her," Meg whispered to himself as he rode away. "Boss, scoundrel, it's all your fault," Connie said as soon as Meg returned to the restaurant. She looked at him resentfully as if she was pregnant with his child. Meg looked at her, perplexed. "Ever since you started that gentleman's league, I almost couldn't get any orders. Gentlemen are indeed all perverts," Connie said angrily. "Those scoundrels were originally mine, but now they've all been snatched away." Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The Gentleman's League had taken care of most of the perverts in Chaos City, but they had indeed snatched away Connie's training resources. He smiled, and said, "Those useless idiots are no longer of much use to you. There are still a few days left. Before that, you'd better look for your master to learn more advanced assassination techniques. If you want to kill your enemies with your own hands, I'm afraid your current power is far from enough." "Is that so?" Connie was taken aback. After thinking for a while, she nodded and said, "All right, I'll look for my master tonight to teach me a new technique." Meg didn't bother with her anymore. He looked at Anna, who was staring blankly out the window, and walked over. He looked at her and gently said, "Don't worry, Blower will come back." "But they're all back, so why isn't he back?" Anna looked up at Meg with concern in her eyes. "Perhaps he was delayed by something on the way back. I've already asked someone to look for him. Once we find him, we'll go and bring him back." Meg consoled her. He was indeed a little worried that Blower hadn't returned to the restaurant. It was most likely because of his father. Hence, when he met Michael and Roland last time, he specially asked them to look for Blower's whereabouts. However, they hadn't received any news so far. What he could be sure of was that at least he hadn't fallen into the hands of the wind forest, and his current whereabouts were unknown. "Millimeter-chim," Anna replied softly. She was still staring blankly out the window. Meg reached out to pat Anna's head gently. He took a look at the clock on the wall, and walked toward the door. "Welcome, Amy's." Meg opened the door with a smile. Another busy day had begun. Chapter 1508. After the morning business hours ended, Meg went to the factory in the north of the city. Irina personally supervised the 20,000 night elves to build an exquisite log factory in a large open space in the north of the city. If it weren't for the eye-catching chimneys, Meg would have thought that he had entered an art park. Of course, the combination of chimneys and exquisite wood carving factory also showed a shocking sense of contrast. "Why are you here?" Irina, who had arrived at the factory early in the morning, looked at Meg, who walked into the office, and was a little surprised. "I came to see how the construction of our art hall is going," Meg said with a smile. "Isn't it a factory?" Irina opened the window. Her office was on the 5th floor, and she could overlook several factories around her. Probably only the elves can build a factory so beautifully. Meg also walked to the window and looked at the factory that was almost completed. At a glance, the perfect combination of industry and nature made him a little amazed. "I have a question to ask you." Irina pointed to the chimneys of the textile factory that were emitting black smoke and frowned slightly. "The smoke emitted after burning coal is poisonous and will have a very bad effect on plants and animals. I don't think it can continue to be emitted like this, and it shouldn't be promoted on a large scale." Meg looked at the chimneys that were emitting black smoke that flew into the blue sky and didn't dissipate for a long time. He didn't expect that the Environmental Protection Agency would still catch him. But looking at this scene, Meg thought of the United Kingdom during the First Industrial Revolution. The tall chimneys announced the arrival of the age of steam, but humans still had to pay for everything they had done. The environment deteriorated, diseases were rampant, and the blue sky no longer existed. Suddenly, he had doubts about his reckless decision to bring the steam engine to this world. If this world entered the age of steam under his intervention, would it be beneficial or harmful to this world where magic existed? Meg could not confirm the answer now, nor did he have the ability to deduce the overall situation. However, he was certain that if the steam engine was popularized and developed disorderly, the blue sky might be lost forever. This is indeed a problem that gives people a headache. Meg nodded. The burning of untreated coal produced a large amount of waste gas. Elves were close to nature and were very sensitive to this. Meg was silent for a moment before he said, "I will do some preliminary processing of the coal and remove sulfur from the smoke to reduce the emission of toxic gases." "How much can it be reduced?" Irina asked. "Currently, the methods we can use are limited. We can probably remove half of them," Meg said after some thought. "All right, I'll take care of the remaining half." Irina smiled sweetly. "I was still thinking about how to deal with the other half. This way, we can achieve a non-toxic discharge." "Huh?" Meg looked at Irina with some surprise. "I've planted a plant called absorption grass in the new chimney. It can survive in very extreme places and has a very strong absorption and purification ability. I've tested it. In a 50-meter-long chimney, it can effectively purify more than half of the toxic gases and then turn them into harmless substances," Irina explained. "There's such a thing." Meg was really a little surprised. The super biological decontamination method could achieve more than 50% of the decontamination effect by planting grass in the chimney. This grass was simply born for decontamination. Is this why you want to build your own factory? Meg looked at Irina. He had previously proposed to let the dwarven craftsman build the factory. It was very efficient and accurate, but Irina rejected it. Yes. Irina nodded. She looked down at the busy elves, and said with a sense of mission, "We believe in the God of life, and are close to the nature that nurtured us. We also love the existence of other life forms. There's no way we can accept the destruction and exploitation of nature to gain wealth. However, these iron lumps that can move by burning charcoal are not only used for our few factories, right?" Irina turned to look at Meg. "Yes. This is a joint project between Miss Hill, Chaos City's City Lord's Castle, and I. The initial purpose is to launch the steam train, and then apply the steam engine to production to increase production efficiency." Meg nodded. These few factories could be considered as pilot projects. It might not take long for the steam engine to take over the world on a large scale and drag this world into the steam age. Can you control it? No. Meg shook his head. No one could stop the high efficiency from replacing the low efficiency. He had already released the steam engine monster, and he no longer had the ability to take it back. Irina's brows furrowed. Meg pondered for a while, and said, "However, I might be able to get them to lower the emissions and reduce the damage to nature. But that's still damage." Irina's brows were still furrowed. Meg fell silent. Although he felt that this was unavoidable, it was just as Irina had said. Even if the emissions were reduced, it was still damage. Humans couldn't cherish and love nature and life like elves. Will it be okay if Amy can't see such a blue sky one day? Meg's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Amy had a pure heart like an elf, and her love for nature and life was no different from an elf's. If the blue sky and white clouds disappeared one day, she would definitely be very sad. "I'll do my best to prevent that day from coming," Meg promised seriously. "I'll be with you." Irina smiled at Meg. Meg looked at the green factories below, and a smile also appeared on his face. "That's easy. Boss, we still haven't gotten any information." None of the people who were caught last night were released. Even the girls from the brothel were not released. The manager looked at the gloomy Bennett nervously. "Who is it that's messing with me?" Bennett slammed his palm on the coffee table, his face as dark as ink. Who could mobilize such a large force from the Grey Temple? He still couldn't figure out when he had provoked such a terrifying enemy. Could it be that Amy's old? It can't be him. Bennett shook his head firmly. Meg wasn't even in the top 100 of his list of enemies. He was just a chef. What right or ability did he have to mobilize the Grey Temple to mess with him? However, since the gambling den and brothel are gone, it seems like I have to do something seriously. Bennett got up, and casually picked up the hat at the side. He said in a low voice, "I'm going to see Miss Rayner again. The hot pot restaurant can do without her, but the recipe must be." Chapter 1509. Before the barbaric development even started, it was already under strict scrutiny and requirements from the Alternate Worlds Environmental Protection Department. Since he really couldn't win, Meg went to the Buffett Manor again after the lunch service ended. Mag turned to She, who was still in her red dress, as he said, "Young Mistress She, after using the steam engine at the factory in the northern part of the city, I discovered that there is a very fatal flaw in the design of the steam engine. Perhaps we should make some changes to that." "Fatal flaw?" Miss Hill sat up straight immediately. Her relaxed expression became serious and nervous all of a sudden. "Yes." Meg nodded with certainty. With an equally serious expression, he said, "If we continue to produce the steam engine on a large scale according to the current design and put it into use, it will bring about an immeasurable disastrous effect on the whole world in the future. It might even cause the extinction of all living things." Miss Hill was stunned. After pondering seriously for a while, she hesitantly said, "Cause the extinction of all living things on the Norland continent just because of a small steam engine? If the use of the steam engine is completely out of control, such a situation is totally possible." Meg nodded. "I would like to hear the details," Miss Hill said to Meg. You know, when my factory was completed, I happened to recruit a batch of elves who had just arrived in Chaos City, and I was fortunate enough to get to know Princess Irina. As she has a large number of elves under her, and I also want to try to diversify, I decided to establish a deeper level of cooperation with her. We will build a series of factories in the north of the city, and prioritize the use of the steam engine. Yes. The Night Elves matter isn't too mysterious in Chaos City recently. In the business world, Mr. Meg's ability to establish a cooperation with Princess Irina has caused quite a stir. Miss Hill nodded with a smile. The cooperation between Meg and Irina to build a factory in the north of the city was indeed a hot topic in the business world recently. After all, it was a labor force of over 20,000 nimble elves. Everyone wanted a share of the profits. However, what they didn't expect was that before the invitations and cooperation letters sent out by the various companies received a reply, the news of Irina collaborating with the boss of Mammy Restaurant had already spread. They were going to diversify their cooperation based on the original small textile factory. This move even received the support of the City Lord's Castle, who allocated a piece of land for the factory at a low price. Although Irina looked a little disheveled when she led the Night Elves away from the Wind Forest. But she was Irina, after all, the powerful and legendary elven princess. The Battle of Rodu's Battle in the Rainy Night. Back then, no one believed that she could lead a few hundred Night Elves to resist Borge and the Wind Forest's encirclement. In the end, she and Alex killed Borge, and successfully drove away the Wind Forest's allied forces. Immediately after that, she barged into the Wind Forest's enthronement ceremony single-handedly, triggering a freedom war that shocked the entire continent. She led the captured elves and 20,000 elven slaves to escape from the Wind Forest where their souls were bound. This was Irina. No matter what kind of situation she was in, she was a woman that no one could ignore. Even though she was in Chaos City now, and only had 20,000 weak elven slaves under her, no one dared to say that the Wind Forest would not be hers in the future. As a woman who was also praised, Hill still felt that she couldn't be compared to Irina now. There was a gap between their outlook and the things they did. Hence, establishing a cooperation with her now was a gamble on the future, a chance to cooperate with the elves. Even Buffett Banks was still planning on how to negotiate with Irina, but Meg, who appeared out of nowhere, intercepted them. A restaurant owner who took down Irina and 20,000 elves. The entire business circle of Chaos City was in an uproar once this news was out. After all, in the eyes of those wealthy, well-connected, and powerful merchants, Mag was just a chef who could cook some good dishes. Could it be that he had used his delicious food to trick Princess Irina into marrying him? Hill was indeed a little shocked when she first heard this news, but she soon felt relieved. After all, Meg was the man who invented the steam engine, and he had established a cooperation with Buffett Banks and Chaos City with just a blueprint and a rough prototype. If this news was released, it would probably cause quite a stir. The steam engine was the future. Hill had no doubt about that. Now, Meg was saying that the steam engine would destroy the future of mankind. What did this have to do with Irina? Meg looked at Hill seriously, and said, "During the cooperation with Princess Irina, she gave me feedback. The process of burning coal in the steam engine releases a large amount of poisonous gas directly into the air without any treatment. When this poisonous gas accumulates to a certain amount, it will greatly affect the natural environment and cause fatal damage to life forms. Once the steam engine is popularized on a large scale, coal will become the most used energy source in this world. A large amount of poisonous gas will be released into the air. Soon, the world will be filled with poisonous gas released into the air, and the future will be dark. Is it that serious?" Hill frowned. Thinking back, every time he visited the base, he would have difficulty breathing. It was indeed uncomfortable to breathe in the black smoke in the air. In this regard, Princess Irina's opinion should be authoritative. No one knows nature and life better than she does. Meg shrugged. Hill nodded slightly, agreeing with Meg's point of view. After all, apart from the Elven Queen, Princess Irina was the only elf who was protected by the Tree of Life. Then, how should we deal with this flaw? Hill asked Meg. She wanted the future. She wanted her name to be engraved in the history of the Norland continent. She didn't want to be known as the Devil Unleasher one day in the future. However, she didn't want to give up on the steam engine. This was an invention that could change the situation of the Norland continent. It was also an opportunity for Buffett Banks to step into a new field and become a leader. We need to solve the problem of the poisonous gas release, and add technical barriers to the steam engine so that the promotion and development of the steam engine can be orderly. In this way, we can minimize the harm to nature caused by the use of the steam engine. We have to be responsible for the future of this world. Meg took out a blueprint, put it on the table, and gently pushed it in front of Hill. I have already thought of a preliminary solution, but to implement it, I need the cooperation of Miss Hill and the City Lord's castle. Hill picked up the blueprint and looked at it carefully for a while. Her brows furrowed from time to time, and her eyes lit up from time to time. After about 10 minutes, she put down the blueprint in her hand and looked at Meg with admiration. It is my honor to work with someone like Mr. Meg. Millimeter HM. Everyone nodded and followed Meg's instructions. Meg rode off on his bicycle. He had originally planned to act alone, but on second thought, MIA and the others also wanted to express their concern for Raina. Furthermore, with the 8th tier frost dragon Elizabeth around, they could easily take care of the other party. There was no need for him to come up with another excuse. The bicycle stopped at the back door of the Grey Temple. My employee has gone missing. It should have something to do with Bennett Marquis. I hope the Grey Temple can give me an explanation. How did she go missing when there were people watching her? Meg said to Burton with a serious expression. Seems like there's a problem with the people watching her. Burton also frowned when he heard that. He looked at Meg and said, "Don't worry, the Grey Temple will find her very soon and bring her back safely. No need. I just need you to tell me where she is now. We will bring her back ourselves." Meg shook his head. Burton looked at Meg and fell silent for a while. He nodded and said, "All right. Give me 20 minutes, and I will tell you where she is." After saying that, he turned and left. Meg waited at the door for about 15 minutes before Burton came back again. He handed a note to Meg and said, "She's at this location now." "Thank you." Meg glanced at the note. On it was written, "Basement of a small courtyard at the end of 13th Street in the west of the city." Then, he turned and left on his bicycle. Seems like the Grey Temple needs a thorough cleansing too. They even dared to interfere with the matters of my intelligence department. Burton turned and went back in with a dark expression. "Now, you have two choices. One is to write down the recipe for the hot pot in full detail. As long as I confirm that it's correct, I will let you go. The other is to die a humiliating death in this secluded basement. Many years later, someone might find a naked corpse here." Bennett sat on a chair with his legs crossed as he looked at Raina, who was tied to a pillar, and said in a low voice. In the dark basement, there was only an oil lamp lit on the stone wall. Apart from Raina and Bennett who were tied to the pillar, there were also 2 orcs and 3 burly men. Hee. When the orcs and burly men heard Bennett's words, they smiled maliciously. Their eyes scanned Raina brazenly. Although this girl looked a little thin and weak, she was quite pretty. "Why, you guys are breaking the law." Raina struggled to shrink back, but her hands and feet were tied tightly with ropes. She was on her way to the restaurant when she suddenly smelled a strange fragrance and lost consciousness. When she woke up again, she was already in this basement. She didn't even know where she was now. She was tied up tightly with ropes, and those burly men with malicious smiles on their faces. A strong sense of fear and helplessness gradually rose in Rena's heart. Since Bennett didn't hide his identity, it meant that she definitely wouldn't be able to leave this basement today. Fear didn't make her lose her rationality. After confirming this, she gradually calmed down. Even if she were to die, she wanted to die with dignity, and not die in humiliation in the hands of these disgusting fellows. "I can help you write the recipe for the hot pot, but you have to promise that you won't find trouble with me after this," Raina said to Bennett. Bennett's eyes lit up. He put down his crossed legs and put on a warm smile. He nodded, and said, "Sure. As long as the recipe is correct, not only will I not make things difficult for you and your mother, I will even give you a generous reward that will be enough to make you rich for the rest of your lives." "All right, I'll write it for you." Raina nodded. "Untie Miss Raina, and bring the pen and paper over," Bennett said with a smile. 2 orcs went forward, untied the ropes on Raina's hands, and handed the pen and paper to her. Raina thought for a while, and started writing on the paper. Her neat and elegant handwriting listed the names of various condiments and spices. "I didn't expect this little girl to be so smart. What a pity. If she had agreed to my request the night before, she wouldn't have ended up like this." Bennett looked at the rich recipe on the paper, and his smile became even more radiant. As long as the hot pot restaurant could be opened, he wouldn't have to worry about money. Just as the people in the cellar gradually relaxed and watched Raina write down the recipe calmly on the paper, Raina suddenly turned the pen around and stabbed it towards her own throat. "Catch her." Bennett's expression changed drastically. However, just as the tip of the pen was a hair's breadth away from Rena's throat, Rena's hand was grabbed by the orc beside her. The orc's other hand grabbed the pen and broke it with a crack before tossing it aside. "How dare you trick me? You really don't know what's good for you." Bennett's expression changed, and he kicked Raina's abdomen, causing her to fall to the ground. He looked at Raina, who was lying on the ground and struggling to grab the broken pen, and waved his hand. "Let her have a taste of living a life worse than death first. Hihi, I'll do it." That orc, who was 2 heads taller than an ordinary person, walked towards Raina with a sinister smile, and reached out his hand to grab Raina's hair. "Catch her, catch her." Right at this moment, the sound of ice freezing could be heard. Frost suddenly appeared on the walls of the cellar, and quickly spread to the ground, surging towards everyone's feet. Chapter 15:11. What's this? Everyone in the cellar was stunned at the sight of this strange scene. While they were still in a daze, the frost had already spread to their feet, and was rapidly spreading upwards. "It's ice magic. Someone's here." That orc was the first to react, and exclaimed. Bennett was also shocked. He pointed at Raina, and said, "Grab her and leave through the secret passage." The orc crushed the frost on his feet, which was not that thick, and reached for Raina's collar with his large hand. However, his movements were much slower. Meanwhile, Bennett was being supported by another orc as he stepped on the ice and walked towards the secret passage that had already been opened. "Is someone here to save me?" Raina was also stunned. Her eyes immediately lit up, and she instinctively wanted to retreat. Bam! Right at this moment, the stone door of the cellar seemed to have received a heavy blow, and suddenly shattered. However, the sky full of rocks froze the moment they flew into the cellar. They were all suspended in mid-air strangely, as if time had been frozen. "I'll hit you." At this moment, a fiery red petite figure pierced through the rubble and kicked the orc in the face. The flaming red wheels stepped on that orc's face, and instantly emitted a charred smell. The terrifying temperature and power caused that orc's face to contort instantly. His huge body flew backward uncontrollably, and crashed into the wall behind him. Amy landed on the ground, and looked at Raina, who was sitting on the ground with her hands on her abdomen. She asked with concern, "Big sister Raina, are you all right?" "Amy." Raina looked at Amy, who suddenly appeared, in surprise and joy. She could not believe her eyes. "Trying to run?" Barbara appeared at the cellar door, and looked at the few people who were rushing towards the secret passage in a panic. She waved her hand, and the rocks floating in midair all flew towards the secret passage. Before they entered the secret passage, they piled up to form a complete stone door. The orc who was supporting Bennett raised his fist and smashed it against the stone door in front of him. With a shattering sound, he screamed as he held his deformed hand and took 2 steps back. A 7th-tier spatial magic caster. That orc looked at Barbara with a hint of fear in his eyes. With the secret passage blocked, Bennett turned back to look at the ladies who were entering the cellar one after another, as well as Meg, who was protected at the back. The veins on his forehead popped out, and he was secretly shocked. How did they find this place? He had clearly avoided the Grey Temple spies and secretly kidnapped Raina, bringing her to this underground cellar that almost no one knew about. What shocked him even more was that all the people present were Mammoth employees, so why was there a 7th-grade spatial magician among them? With such powerful strength, and the extremely rare space element, how could she be willing to stay in the restaurant and serve dishes? His 2 most powerful subordinates had been captured in the ambush last night, and the 2 orcs under him were only at the 6th tier. They were completely defenseless against a 7th-tier spatial magic caster. That half-elf girl who looked like she was only 4 or 5 years old also made him shudder with fear. That was a 6th-tier orc, yet he was sent flying by her kick. To have such terrifying strength at such a young age, she had to be the genius that the 2 great magic casters were fighting over to take in as their disciple. The situation that was originally under his control instantly went out of control. Bennett's expression changed a few times, but he quickly put on a smile as he looked at Meg, and smilingly said, "Yo, what brings Mr. Mac here? Today, I'm just inviting, bam." Before Bennett could finish his sentence, Yarbemia had already taken out a frying pan from somewhere and smacked it on his face, sending him straight into the stone wall at the side. Is there something he hasn't finished? Yarbemia put away the frying pan in his hand, and looked at Bennett, who was in a daze from the smack, with a little embarrassment. "It's all right. You did well, MIA." Meg looked at Bennett, who was still in a daze, and walked straight to Raina. He reached out to help her up, and concernedly said, "It's all right. We're here. Boss, and everyone." Raina looked at Meg and the rest, and her eyes reddened. She had thought that she was going to die of humiliation and despair here today, but she didn't expect Meg and the rest to come at the last moment. Of course, what she didn't expect even more was that everyone was so powerful, be it Amy, who sent that terrifying orc flying with a kick, Barbara, who could control rocks, or Yarbemia, who sent Bennett flying with a frying pan. They were all beyond her imagination. It turned out that the boss didn't lie to her. There really was a powerful restaurant behind her. "She's injured. We don't have any healing-type magic casters here, so we can only do some simple treatment." Elizabeth went forward, and looked at Raina's scratched little finger. With a tap of her finger, a stream of water flowed over the scratched skin, and the sand and stones on the wound were removed. "We'll be back soon." Meg handed Raina over to Gina, and walked towards Bennett himself. "Ah!" The 2 orcs and 3 burly men shouted as they charged towards Meg. This fellow seemed to be the weakest among them. If they couldn't control him first, they might not be able to leave today. "Ice seal." Why, Elizabeth softly spat out 2 cold words. Crack, the frost on the ground spread over instantly, and automatically parted under Meg's feet. Then, it froze the orcs and burly men charging towards him into ice sculptures. Bennett, who was stunned by the frying pan, had just come back to his senses. He looked at his subordinates who had turned into ice sculptures, and his expression changed drastically. That Ice Beauty's abilities seemed to be even more terrifying. How many terrifying fellows were hidden in this restaurant? Why were they willing to work for him? "I've said it before. Don't touch my people. Otherwise, you'll lose everything," Meg said coldly as he walked in front of Bennett. "Why, you can't kill me. I'm Bennett Marquis, the younger brother of the Marquis family's patriarch," Bennett said with a face full of fear. "Useless little brother. You don't know how much that elder brother of yours wishes for you to die." Meg laughed mockingly. Bennett's face was pale. He knew very well that Meg was right. That elder brother of his was just like him. He wished for him to die early every day. Meg lifted his leg and kicked Bennett's crotch. As the sound of a century egg cracking was heard, an extremely tragic cry could be heard from the cellar. "Don't worry, I won't kill you. As a law-abiding citizen, what I want to do is not to send you to meet God, but to let the law punish you." Meg retracted his leg, and looked at Bennett, who was curled up on the ground and convulsing in pain. He slowly bent down. "After all, you haven't seen all your precious things being lost with your own eyes." Chapter 15:12. Let's go. The Grey Temple will be here soon. Meg turned to hold Amy's hand, and walked towards the entrance of the cellar. But Raina, who was being supported by Gina, turned to look at Bennett with fear in her eyes. Would he do the same thing again if they let him go? Don't worry. The lifetime membership room in the Bastille prison is already open to him. He can only stay in the dark cell until he dies. Meg stopped in his tracks and smiled at Raina. Raina, you don't have to worry that he will appear again. Raina looked at Meg's gentle smile and felt the uneasiness in her heart disappear. She nodded and said, "Millimeter. It's so easy. I only hit him once, and all the bad guys were taken care of." Amy was still unsatisfied. She turned to look at Bennett, who was still groaning on the ground, and said, "Hey, Uncle, you have to work harder next time. Bring more people with you. You don't look powerful at all. It's so disappointing." Bennett looked up at Amy with grief and indignation. "Is she even human? Let's go." Meg led everyone out of the cellar and climbed out of the dry well in the corner of the yard. "Stop right there. You have been surrounded. Put your hands up and stand in the corner." As soon as Meg and the rest came out of the dry well, they heard a stern voice. A group of people wearing the Grey Temple's inspection department's uniform surrounded them. The knight's swords were already out of their sheaths, and the magic caster's staffs were also aimed at them. They were ready to attack. The leader was a tall and skinny middle-aged man. His gaze paused on Raina for a while, and he said with a gloomy face, "I am the captain of the Grey Temple's inspection department, Blaze. You are suspected of kidnapping, detention, and malicious assault. Please cooperate with the investigation." Meg looked at Blaze with squinted eyes. He had thought that the people waiting outside were here to capture Bennett, but now it seemed that the Grey Temple was not completely united. This so-called captain of the inspection division was probably not one of Borge's men. He smiled and said, "May I know how Lord Blaze determined that we were involved in kidnapping, detaining, and malicious harm? Who did we kidnap? Who was detained? Who did he hurt? Did anyone report it to you?" "You." Blaze choked. He looked at Meg and didn't know what to say. He was also shocked by his stupid teammate, Bennett. He had sent the patrolman away so that he could find a chance to leave. He didn't expect this idiot to attack the shop assistant and kidnap her. The kidnapping was not a big deal. It was just a shop assistant, and he was ready to clean up the mess for him. However, he did not expect that this incident would attract the attention of the intelligence department. The subordinate in charge of handling this matter had been called away and had not returned. That was why he specially brought people over. Before he arrived, he felt a powerful magical wave coming from the cellar. Then, he met Meg and the rest who came out of the cellar. Needless to say, he had already guessed what had happened down there. While he was surprised that the restaurant owner could find such powerful helpers, he also decided to bite back at Meg and the rest. Otherwise, once Bennett was captured by the intelligence department, he would not be able to hide with their interrogation methods. Blaze quickly regained his composure and sternly said, "We received a report that the owner of Ben Tea House, Bennett, had gone missing. Before this, the shop assistant had heard you threatening him. Meg and your men from Amy's, I am warning you now. All of you, stand against the wall and surrender yourselves. If you dare to defy the law, we will take measures against you. You, bring a team down to take a look." Blaze waved his hand at the same time, and a team of 5 went down to the cellar. "No, it's not like that. He kidnapped me. Boss and the rest are here to save me." "It's not like what you're saying," Raina said anxiously. She was so aggrieved that tears were welling up in her eyes. Wasn't the Grey Temple the guardian of Chaos City? Why would they accuse others? "Madam, you have the right to remain silent. However, everything you say now will be used as evidence in court. If you are suspected of slander, you will be charged even more." Blaze glanced at Raina coldly. "Don't worry. They can't stop us if we want to leave." Elizabeth stood in front of Raina, and also looked at Blaze coldly. Her frosty aura made Blaze look away instinctively. It was the 8th tier ice-type magic wave that she had released earlier. Not long after, the Grey Temple's inspectors crawled out of the cellar with a pale Bennett and 5 ice sculptures. "Help! Help! I was kidnapped by them. They killed my subordinates, and even wanted to kill me." Bennett's face was pale as he pointed at Meg weakly. He gritted his teeth and said, She is the leader. Blaze's lips curled up slightly. He waved his hand at Meg and the rest, and said, "Arrest them." "Father, are these people baddies too? I remember that they are people who maintain order." Amy went closer to Meg. She was a little puzzled, but also a little eager. "Perhaps." Meg smiled mockingly. If he had a mind to condemn someone, he would easily find a pretext. This inspector was obviously on Bennett's side. Since that was the case, there was no need for him to have any illusions about them. However, Meg wasn't too worried about that. Although there were more than 30 people on the other side, and this Inspector Blaze was an 8th tier knight and a few 7th tier magic casters, they would still be able to crush them if they really fought. As for how to deal with them after the fight, that was up to them. Then, do we kill them directly, or do we go through the procedures? Amy continued to ask. We are law-abiding citizens, after all. Let's go through the procedures, Meg said with a smile. Millimeter. Amy nodded, and then took a step forward. She pointed her wand at them, and said, I am Amy's little boss, the disciple of the Lord of Ice and the Lord of Fire, and a magic caster's apprentice from Chaos School. Now, I am warning you to give up resisting and surrender. Otherwise, I will destroy you on behalf of the moon. Although I don't know why the moon wants to destroy you, I agree on behalf of the moon, Barbara added. Little fellow, being overconfident is not a good thing. Even the Lord of Ice and the Lord of Fire have to abide by the laws and rules in Chaos City. They still have to kneel in front of the Grey Temple. And if you resist the Grey Temple, you will pay a terrible price. Blaze sneered. It would be great if they resisted. Battles were uncontrollable, and it wouldn't be strange if a few people died. You should say that in front of my master. Really, Amy suggested seriously. Go, little fire lotuses. Amy threw out 10-odd glass bottles containing 2 colored fire lotuses from the space in her magic caster's staff, and flew them towards Blaze. Chapter 15:13. My lord, according to the latest news, Blaze has personally led his men to the 13th Street in the west of the city without receiving my orders. The kidnapping is definitely related to him and the inspection division. The confession of the guy in the inspection division also proves that Blaze and Bennett have always maintained a very close relationship, Burton said quickly as he handed an urgent letter to Roland. Roland took the letter and skimmed through it. He pondered for a while before looking up at Burton. Does this have anything to do with Godalla? There's no evidence to prove that Deputy Lord Godalla is related to this matter. Burton shook his head. But he's in charge of the inspection division after all. Roland put down his hand and instructed Burton, bring some men to settle this matter. Don't alarm Crassus and Julian. It'll be very troublesome if they take action. Bring Blaze back and find out how many other people are related to this matter. Yes. Burton nodded and turned to leave quickly. Tap tilde tap tilde tap tilde. Roland tapped his finger on the table lightly as if he was thinking seriously about something. After a while, he slowly stood up and walked towards the door. Godalla, you'd better not disappoint me. Explode, little fire lotus. As Amy's childish voice rang out, the 2-colored fire lotus in the small bottle she threw out exploded instantly. Blaze, who was originally relaxed, had a slight change in expression. He slashed forward with his long sword and split open a fireball that was coming straight at him. At the same time, he retreated a few meters to avoid the tongues of fire that were coming at him. Resisting the law with violence is an additional crime. Subdue them. Blaze shouted with a serious expression. After that, he added, don't hurt that child. Although he said that he was not afraid, he was still unwilling to bear the wrath of the Lord of Ice and the Lord of Fire. After all, those two were really big shots. Even the Lord of the Holy Temple would have a headache when he saw them. How would he dare to provoke them? The people of the Grey Temple heard him and attacked Meg and the rest. The knights charged forward, and the magic casters also unleashed the spells that they had been storing up for a long time, smashing towards them. Frost Domain. Elizabeth took a step forward, and said softly in a cold voice. The temperature in the small courtyard plummeted in an instant, and an icy blue protective barrier appeared around the group, blocking all the magic attacks. Elizabeth raised her hand. Frost rose from the feet of the charging knights and quickly spread towards their bodies. In the blink of an eye, they were frozen along with their terrified faces. I respect Chaos City's laws and rules because they bring dignity and safety to the weak. However, it would be too ironic if the law enforcers were a bunch of scum. Elizabeth walked out of the protective shield and walked towards Blaze step by step. Her eyes were filled with disappointment. Damn it. Blaze's expression changed. This woman's power had exceeded his expectations. He lowered his head and looked at the frozen ground beneath his feet. His eyelids twitched. As a grade 8 knight, he clearly knew what it meant to step into the opponent's domain. Space-type giant dragons were really difficult to deal with. If I'm not wrong, you should be the Frost Dragon Princess Elizabeth. If you don't want the Frost Dragon tribe to become enemies with Chaos City, you'd better face up to what you're doing now and see if you've crossed the bottom line of the Grey Temple and Chaos City, Blaze said sternly. Everything you've done has crossed my bottom line, Elizabeth said coldly. Elizabeth said in a cold voice. She took a step forward and her figure suddenly disappeared. When she reappeared, her right hand, which was covered in frost dragon scales, had already punched Blaze's face. Bam! With a dull thud, Blaze was sent flying. His long sword made a 5-meter-long trench on the wall before he managed to stop himself. However, before he could regain his balance, a leg covered in dragon scales appeared from the space and kicked him in the stomach, sending him flying again. In the frost domain, Elizabeth appeared and disappeared unpredictably. She was trampling on Blaze like a god. The crowd, who had been prepared for a fierce battle, watched this scene with their mouths agape and eyes wide open. Their faces were filled with shock. Big Sister Elizabeth is so powerful. Connie swallowed her saliva. She suddenly felt that the assassination that she was so proud of paled in comparison. Big Sister is so powerful. Yarbemia was also shocked. Although she always knew that Elizabeth was very powerful, she didn't expect her to be so powerful. Sigh. I'm not going to get a share of this baddie again. Amy sighed with a little resentment. She began to make small fireballs secretly, and threw one at Blaze from time to time. Is the domain really so powerful? Meg was also a little surprised when he saw this scene. They were both 8th tier knights, but an 8th tier knight was pressed to the ground in Elizabeth's frost domain without any resistance. The Frost Dragon tribe's royal innate ability was indeed amazing. Of course, the domain was not unbreakable. As long as your sword was fast enough, and you were powerful enough. Any domain could be split open with a sword. Just like Alex in the past. He split open Rankster's frost domain, which was known as the strongest domain, and then cut that dragon down from its altar. However, since Elizabeth could solve the problem alone, Meg was naturally very happy. He might cause some unnecessary trouble if he made a move. Of course, he wouldn't make a move if he could help it. Blaze was beaten into a pig's head in the frost domain. He was kicked into the ice with a look of grief and indignation. Only half of his body was exposed outside. Frost quickly covered him, and he was frozen into an ice sculpture. Elizabeth landed on the ground lightly. She raised her hand, and the frost domain disappeared instantly. All that was left was an ice sculpture in the yard. Bennett, who was in the ice sculpture, was stunned. He still couldn't believe what he had seen. These fellows even dared to mess with the Grey Temple. Burton had just arrived with the people from the intelligence department. He had a strange expression on his face when he saw this scene. You're also on the same side. Elizabeth turned to look at Burton. She could sense a dangerous aura from this human. This was a powerhouse whose strength exceeded the 9th tier. He was even more powerful than Fox. It's a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding. Burton hurriedly waved his hand. He looked at Meg and said, Mr. Mack, we heard that someone has kidnapped your restaurant's employees. We're here to rescue them. This is different from what we heard just now. After all, 5 minutes ago, we were still robbers who kidnapped a wealthy merchant. We're being interrogated strictly by the Grey Temple's inspection department. Meg looked at Burton with a half-smile. Chapter 15-14. The atmosphere in the small courtyard was a little awkward. The people from the intelligence department who came with Bolton more or less knew the inside story. They looked at Blaze and the rest with disdain. Burton glanced at Blaze and Bennett, who had been frozen into ice sculptures, and narrowed his eyes slightly. He really spared no effort in tarnishing the Grey Temple's integrity and dignity. "I'm sorry, everyone. The Grey Temple will definitely give you an explanation on this matter. I promise that the Grey Temple will deal with the problematic personnel seriously and bring the real culprit to justice," Bolton said to Meg and the rest seriously. Meg looked at Bolton with a serious expression and said, "I hope the same thing won't happen again. After all, the citizens of Chaos City rely on the Grey Temple to enforce the law and protect them. If we can't even trust the Grey Temple, then the system that Chaos City is so proud of will not be far from collapse. I have already reported this matter to the Lord. Everyone involved will be severely punished to ensure the Grey Temple's reputation and reputation." Bolton nodded. Judging from how much the Lord valued Meg, Meg was definitely not an ordinary restaurant owner. Furthermore, what he said was exactly what he was worried about. "Elizabeth, leave the scene to them," Meg said to Elizabeth's back. Elizabeth hesitated for a while, but still put down her hand. The cold air in the surroundings disappeared instantly, but those ice sculptures did not thaw. Burton heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. His gaze lingered on Rena for a while, and he saw her clutching her abdomen. He then said, "Medic, treat this injured lady." "Yes." A female magic caster came forward to check on Rena's injuries before chanting a spell. Streaks of white light landed on Rena's body, and color gradually returned to Rena's pale face. Her furrowed brows also relaxed. "Thank you. I've completely recovered." Rena thanked the magician with a look of amazement on her face. It was the first time that someone had used a healing spell on her. Magic was indeed amazing. Princess Irina and Sister 1111 had used such amazing magic to cure her mother. Seeing that Rena had recovered, Meg's expression also softened a little. His anger towards the Grey Temple's unprofessional performance also subsided a little, and he led everyone away. "Minister, don't we need to keep them to record their statements?" A staff member asked softly. "If you're not afraid that Crassus and Julian will tear down the Grey Temple after hearing that their precious disciple was attacked by someone from the Grey Temple, then go ahead," Bolton snapped as he walked towards Blaze. "Then?" The staff member gasped and shrank his head. "Forget it then. Our intelligence department never needs any witnesses to collect evidence. Criminals are the best witnesses. Boss, I'm sorry. I delayed the restaurant's opening because of me." He walked to the street and flagged down a carriage. He asked MIA and the others to send Rena home first. Meg then led Amy, Gina, and the others to the second carriage and went straight back to the restaurant. When the carriage was about to reach the restaurant, Meg felt the anger from the foodies. "Mr. Mac, open the door. We're starving. If you don't open the door, we'll die in front of you." The coachman murmured to himself with a curious expression, "Did this boss Mag do something to incur the wrath of the heavens? Why are there so many troublemakers?" No, he was just delayed by something and opened the door a little late. Meg coughed softly to cover his embarrassment. "Heh, procrastinating? Serves you right." The coachman laughed in Schadenfreude. "Back then, when I was able to wield a knife, I was also a respectable person. That was until I began to stand my customers up. Look at my right hand and left leg, they're both broken." Meg looked at his bent left leg and deformed right hand and couldn't help but shudder. He couldn't afford to offend them. "Say, where did all of you go?" An angry voice sounded. Meg looked up at the kitchen door. Camilla was leaning against the kitchen door with a hint of resentment in her eyes. "Yeah, she left us at home and didn't even have a bite to eat." Irina also came out of the kitchen. She leaned against the other side of the kitchen and said in disappointment, "The food she made was terrible. Vampires eat raw food because they don't know how to cook." No. Camilla blushed and said in embarrassment, "We just don't want to waste time on such things. Noble vampires, time is very precious." Mag looked at Camilla sympathetically. He could roughly guess what had happened to Camilla when she was alone with Irina when they weren't together. "Does the sheep think the same?" Amy asked Camilla curiously. "How can a lowly sheep be compared to a noble vampire?" Camilla said with a serious expression. "But sheep eat grass too," Meg said with a smile. "You." Camilla choked. She didn't know how to retort. She could only turn her head and snort angrily. "Something happened this afternoon, so we all went out. We didn't prepare the ingredients. I'll go upstairs to change, and then we'll open for business." "Let's get ready, everyone," Meg said, and quickly walked up the stairs. "What happened?" Irina asked. "Some bad guy took big sister Rena away, so we went to find the big bad guy." "She's the big bad guy," Amy answered quickly. "Yes, princess," Phyllis confirmed. "How could you not call me along when something like this happened? You're not a good friend at all." Irina sighed. "Chaos City is too peaceful. There isn't even any big news. The situation was urgent, so we didn't have time to inform everyone." Meg changed into his chef's uniform and went downstairs. He looked at Irina and said, "Moreover, the opponent was too weak. We promised not to use you first." "All right." Irina pursed her lips. She quickly became interested again, and asked, "Then, when are we going to the Twilight Forest to stir up trouble?" "Come to think of it, we should be setting off the day after tomorrow." Meg thought for a while. "Very good." Irina nodded. She walked up the stairs, and said, "I'll go upstairs to rest for a while." "All right, princess. I'll send your dinner up later," Phyllis said very consciously. Irina stopped in her tracks, and thought for a while. She turned back, and said, "Steak, medium well." "All right," Meg and Phyllis answered almost at the same time. The corners of Irina's mouth curled up slightly, and she went upstairs. After Irina disappeared at the top of the stairs, Camilla looked at Meg and said, "I want to eat steak, medium well, too." "All right. I'll fry the skin for you." Meg walked into the kitchen, took out 2 steaks from the fridge, and began to fry them. "I didn't expect Blaze to do such a thing behind my back." A middle-aged elf with long blonde hair looked at Roland in shock. She looked at Raina in disbelief and said, "So much money every month?" "Yes, boss gave everyone a raise. Everyone's salary is 20,000 copper coins, and there will be a raise every year." Raina nodded with certainty. She could not hide the joy on her face. She was in a gloomy mood yesterday and did not have time to think about the raise. Now that she thought about it carefully, 20,000 copper coins was a huge sum of money for her. It was almost equivalent to her previous year's salary. "Isn't it too much? You've only started working for less than 2 months. Boss still lets us live in such a good place and eat his food every day." Karen's was a little worried. "Yes, I also think it's too much." Raina also nodded and said, "But boss said that the restaurant's profits are very good, so he gave us a raise. Mr. Mack is really a good person. It's your fortune to have met him." Karen sighed. "Millimeter. Raina nodded gently. Her ears turned red when she thought about how she actually cried in boss's arms just now. Good person card +1. Meg listened to the notification sound in his mind in bewilderment. This was not even as pleasant as receiving 3 yuan from Alipay. However, he had to admit that he was indeed a good person. "Come, give this super insanely spicy grilled fish to that orc who is flirting over there." Meg passed a freshly cooked grilled fish to MIA with a smile. "I'm going out for a while. I might be back late." Irina appeared in the kitchen, put down the empty plate of steak, and then disappeared quickly. Before Meg could ask, she was already gone. He could not help but grumble, "What are you going to do in the middle of the night?" 150 kilometers to the west of Chaos City was a place called the Thunderstorm Mountains. There was a dense forest there, and magic beasts were everywhere. There were very few people there. The most amazing thing was that there were rumbles of thunder all year round. Lightning would strike down trees and rocks from time to time. The lightning elements were extremely violent, hence the name Thunderstorm Mountains. After winter, the Thunderstorm Mountains were covered in snow. The sound of thunder lessened, and there was a short period of silence. Right now, in the depths of the mountains, there was a huge crater with a diameter of over 500 meters and a depth of tens of meters. The trees around the crater seemed to have been struck by lightning, and were all charred black. And right in the middle of the crater, there was a dark crater with a diameter of about 2 meters. It was bottomless, and even the moonlight seemed to have been swallowed up. At this moment, there were 2 figures standing in front of the deep pit, looking in. "Old Ice, can you tell what this is? I seem to have sensed the aura of an evil spirit." Krasu threw a fireball into the deep pit. The fireball kept falling until it disappeared completely, but the bottom was still nowhere to be seen. Julian, who was standing beside the crater, had already closed his eyes. He pointed his finger into the crater, and frost started to solidify at the entrance of the crater, and spread down the wall rapidly. About 3 minutes later, Julian suddenly opened his eyes and retracted his finger. At the same time, he took 3 steps back. "Did you scare yourself?" Krasu looked at Urian suspiciously, and then poked his head into the pit to take a look. Boom! An explosion sounded from the crater, and a powerful black airflow swept countless icicles and ice shards out of the crater. Holy shit! Crassus also jumped back quickly. He looked at the icicles that were swept up into the sky by the black airflow and exploded into ice shards. He said angrily, "Old Ice, you did this on purpose, didn't you? It's the aura of an evil spirit. I'm afraid that the evil spirit sealed under the Thunderstorm Mountains has already broken a part of the seal. That's why it's able to release its aura to attract its subordinates and descendants," Urian said in a hoarse voice. Krasu spat on the ground and looked at the lingering black airflow in the sky with annoyance. These immortal old things are really annoying. Chapter 15-17. Once the evil god is unsealed, it will bring harm to the world. It will cause great suffering and even destroy the Norland continent. Urian looked up at the air current in the sky, and raised a hand toward the sky. Frost quickly formed an ice ball, which froze the air current. The ice ball then landed at the entrance of the crater, and layers of ice quickly formed, instantly sealing the entrance of the crater. Your seal can only prevent its aura from leaking out for a month at most. Once it controls other people or attracts believers of the evil god, it will probably be able to escape very quickly. Krasu glanced at the ice ball that sealed the deep pit, and his expression turned grave. He shook his head and said, "Your seal can only prevent its aura from leaking out for a month at most. It's better than doing nothing." Julian retracted his hand, and coughed loudly. Crassus pursed his lips, and a ball of fire surrounded him. He rubbed his hands, and said, "Regarding the legend of the evil god, we only got half of a parchment from the cannibals 100 years ago. I didn't expect it to be true. This aura is indeed a little evil. The cannibals were bewitched by the evil god. That's why they became bloodthirsty and cruel. They had already lost their rationality, and were living on their twisted instincts. That's why we wiped them out." Julian waved his hand gently, and flattened the 500-meter deep pit. Snow covered it, and other than the lack of trees, it didn't seem any different from before. What exactly happened in ancient times? No one knows how many gods are sealed and in hibernation in this world. But I'm afraid our power alone is far from enough to fight them, Julian said. The wrinkles on his face seemed to have deepened. "Hihi, I have a different idea. Fighting with the evil god. Just thinking about it makes me excited. Why don't we go down this pit and take a look? Let's see what the sealed evil god looks like, and if it's really that powerful." Crassus chuckled. "Sure, bring me along. I also want to see what these so-called gods look like." A white figure suddenly appeared on the snowy ground. She smiled at Crassus, and said, "I'll be in charge of digging." "No, no, no. Don't be serious, madam. I'm just saying." Crassus quickly stopped Irina, but he quickly reacted and looked at her in surprise. "Why are you here? If you can sense it, why can't I? My spiritual power is only slightly weaker than that old man Julian's, but it's much stronger than yours." Irina pursed her lips in a matter-of-fact manner. "Hihi, that's true." Crassus scratched his head, speechless. "Is the evil god really sealed underneath?" Irina asked curiously. She was not in a hurry to break the ice. The residual aura in the air gave her a familiar feeling. She had encountered such a mysterious aura twice before. Julian shook his head. His expression was still serious, and he didn't relax at all because of Irina's words. "If that's the case, we'll have to fight with them sooner or later." Irina put away the parchment. A circle of light green light appeared under her feet. She said, "Lend me the parchment for a few days. I'll return it to you. Bring me." Before Crassus could finish his sentence, Irina had already disappeared along with the teleportation portal. "I don't want to share a flying mount with this old man." Crassus looked at Julian with disdain. "You can fly back yourself." Julian stretched out his hand to summon a snow-white eagle. He jumped onto the eagle's back. "Why should I fly back when there's a free-flying mount? I'm not flying." Crassus snorted and jumped onto the eagle's back. The old rulers really exist. Meg looked at the parchment that Irina brought back with a strange expression. Chapter 15:18. You know about the Great Old Ones? Irina looked at Meg in surprise as well. She thought for a while, and then realized something. "No wonder you know how to kill Borge and the bewitched Alfred. I only saw some related records in an ancient parchment book by chance. I thought it was just a haphazardly written history. I didn't expect them to really exist." Meg rubbed his nose. He really didn't expect the Chulhu mythos to really exist in this world. During this period of time, he had read almost all the books related to the Chulhu mythos, and absorbed the imagination of countless authors from Earth. He had no way to analyze how many of them really understood the Great Old Ones, and how many of them were created by imagination under the influence of Lovecraft's mythos system. However, after the baptism of these ancient books, he had a basic understanding of the Chulhu mythos system. The Great Old Ones, who had terrifying power, once ruled the world in ancient times, but were sealed by the ancient gods and fell into a deep sleep. Under this system, countless colorful works were created, and many of the Great Old Ones appeared. Meg still had many doubts about the Great Old Ones that might exist on the Norland continent. The previous two encounters were also very shallow. Whether it was the stone statue in the Black Fog or the throne in the Stone Palace, he couldn't match them with the various Great Old Ones that had accumulated during this period of time. The parchment that Irina got from Crassus and the rest was roughly a wizard's prayer after the system's online translation. It praised the power and legends of an evil god named Meredith, and mentioned a few other evil gods, showing extreme fanaticism. The last sentence caught his attention. The Great Old Ones will eventually return and rule this world again. Did the various phenomena that suddenly appeared in this world mean that the return had already begun? What exactly are the Great Old Ones? Can they be eaten? What do they look like? Irina asked Meg curiously. Meg thought seriously for a while, and said, "The legendary Great Old Ones are probably indescribable things with all kinds of tentacles." Tentacles? It sounds a little disgusting. Can I do it? Irina frowned. "Teppanyaki squid seems pretty good," Meg said after some thought. "All right, let's catch a Great Old One and try it next time. I just don't know if the meat will be too tough to chew after millions of years." Irina was already itching to try. After all, this world used to belong to them. We should at least give them some face. Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry. They spoke as if they could beat them. Even if they were sealed old ones, he didn't have the confidence to cut off their tentacles and make them into teppanyaki squid tentacles. As for Blauer, I still haven't received any news about him. What I can confirm is that he hasn't fallen into Helena's hands, Meg said. Irina already knew that Blauer was Shirley. She shook her head, and said, I haven't received any news about him, either. I don't have many sources of information at the moment, but if he's captured by Helena, I'll go save him. He might be affected by the news of his father's death. I hope he can calm down. Mag heaved a faint sigh. He had witnessed Blower's father charging fearlessly toward those people who were attacking Irina, and buying them some time. One day, I will make them pay the price for this, Irina said with a cold expression. Meg was silent. He naturally knew Irina's character. I will continue to get people to help find him as soon as possible, Meg said. You said we'll set off for the Fork tribe the day after tomorrow. Do you have a plan? Irina asked. Meg shook his head slightly, and said, I don't have a detailed plan at the moment. Rescuing Connie's brother is the priority. Secondly, we have to find a chance to disrupt the coronation ceremony of the Kingslayer, Gary, and find a way to stop the Fork tribe and the August tribe from forming an alliance. Once the alliance between these two tribes is successful, the Orcs will basically be on the side of the war alliance. No plan is the best plan. Isn't it just causing trouble until there's no end to it? I'm very good at that. Irina's eyes lit up when she heard that, and she smiled. Meg looked at Irina, whose eyes were glowing with excitement, and sighed for the Fork tribe silently. Nothing good would come out of being targeted by this great aunt. Amy and Anna are already asleep. It's late at night. Shall we do something interesting? Irina asked as she leaned against the door. Her long and slender legs were exposed from the loose sleeping robe, and her soft silver hair was let down behind her back. She stared at Meg as she asked. Meg thought about it calmly for a while before taking out the tablet. Why don't we watch Cat and Mouse? Watch it yourself. Irina walked towards the bedroom angrily, and closed the door. Phew, that was close. Meg heaved a sigh of relief, and wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. He felt like he was being targeted by a god at that moment. Luckily, he was quick-witted. Cat and Mouse is so interesting. Meg switched on the tablet, and watched 2 episodes with relish before switching off the lights and going to bed. It was late at night, and most of the people in Chaos City were already asleep. The number of suspicious people roaming the streets had dwindled after the Gentlemen's League's strict screening. Even the tramps were hiding under the bridges obediently, and didn't dare to come out in the middle of the night to scare the young ladies. Even the slums in the north of the city didn't have any vicious incidents for a period of time. All the famous gangsters had been sent to Bastille prison by those gentlemen who had turned into Sherlock Holmes after they found evidence of their crimes. Due to the shortage of prison cells, the density of the cells in Bastille prison increased immediately. It was said that it even caused some of the natives to be unhappy. Meanwhile, the Grey Temple and the City Lord's Castle also increased the number of patrols on the streets, which really allowed the residents to have a good night's sleep. In the Grey Temple's dark dungeon, there was no difference between day and night in this place where no light could reach. Screams echoed from the partitioned cells into the gloomy and empty corridor, echoing in the distance and only dispersing after a long time. There was a dim oil lamp at the end of the corridor. Bolton stood under the lamp, and stuffed some high-quality tobacco into his bamboo pipe. He lit it up with a flint, and took a deep puff. He looked at his subordinate who was rushing out of the cell next door with a piece of paper, and asked, "How is it?" "Director, we've already done the torture. Blaze still insists that he did everything alone. He also confessed to everyone under his system. He's not online." The subordinate handed the paper in his hand to Burton. Bolton took the paper, and skimmed through the contents. He sneered, and said, "Is he really not online, or is he still expecting something? Wonderful bookhouse." Chapter 15-19. Master, why are we going to Chaos City? Is it just for fat head fish? Joey asked softly as he helped Master Rome take off his thick coat. Joss, who was making the bed at the side, also looked at Master Rome. Although they set off more than a month later than the original plan, the news of Master Rome leaving Isen Castle still caused quite a stir. Many people came to see them off on the day of their departure, including many visitors who had been waiting at the door for a long time. Master Rome, who almost never left home, was leaving the workshop that he had been in for hundreds of years. This was very strange in itself. And the fact that he chose Chaos City as his destination was even more surprising. Master Rome did not have any special experience there in his life. Joey and Joss could roughly guess the reason. Ever since that Mr. Meg came, Master Rome had been preparing to move. It was Fathead Fish who made me think it through. I've been living for forging my entire life, and I've forged marvelous weapons one after another. I've gained some fame, but I've never received any substantial benefits except for the endless orders and requests. While my mind is still clear, I want to move to a new place to live. I only want to make one more weapon in the remaining time, a weapon that is different from before, Master Rome said with a smile as he sat by the bed. Then those requests that we received previously, Joey said softly. Reject them all. I don't have time to make those things for them anymore. Rome shook his head with a smile, and said, that's not what I want to do. They don't deserve this last weapon. It has to be left for the fated one. Yes. Joey nodded with a hint of sadness in his eyes. Joss also stood at the side silently, and did not know what to say. Dwarfs have to die eventually. I have lived for more than 400 years. It's long enough. Rome looked at the two of them with a smile, and said, speaking of which, I have never taken in a proper disciple. The two of you have suffered a lot with me. Learn well in the coming days. How much you can learn will depend on your ability and endurance. Yes. Joey and Joss hurriedly replied, their eyes shining brightly. Master, there are too many of these bad guys. Why don't we kill some of them? Leaving them alive is just a waste of food and air. In the Bastille prison, Connie was following behind Lex. Looking at the prison that was gradually filling up, he covered his nose but was unable to block out the stench. Killing a person is the most lenient punishment for his crimes. Rex said expressionlessly as he broke the hand of a prisoner who was trying to pick the lock and stuffed it back in. Then what's the point of keeping them here? Connie didn't understand. Make sure they can't die a quick death, Lex answered calmly. Connie glanced at the cell where the fight was going on. 7 or 8 prisoners were crammed into a cell that could only fit 2 people. It was impossible for them to live comfortably. Master, I'm going home the day after tomorrow. Will you go back with me? Connie quickened his pace to catch up with Lex. He asked softly as he looked at him expectantly. No. Lex's answer was simple as usual. Master, you might lose your disciple forever like this. Connie rolled his eyes. It's okay. I think that every time you go out. Goodbye. Connie turned and left angrily. 10 minutes later. Master, why are you in front of me? 20 minutes later. Master, what a coincidence. 30 minutes later. Master, are you lost too? Lex, in a magnificent hall in the Marquis Manor, Bowen was pacing back and forth in the hall. He was overjoyed as he muttered to himself, this fellow has indeed dug his own grave. Master, Bennett is a member of the Marquis family after all. Will this have a negative impact on us or even implicate us? The old butler asked worriedly. He's a lowly illegitimate son of a prostitute. He's afraid that others won't know his identity, so he's proclaiming that he's a member of the Marquis family. Isn't he just coveting my position as the head of the family? However, I already knew that his money came from illegal sources. I was afraid that he would implicate us one day, so I asked the family's businesses and people to draw a line with him. Even if he committed a grave crime, it has nothing to do with the Marquis family, Bowen said with a relaxed smile. Master, you have foresight. The old butler hurriedly flattered him. He thought for a while, and said, Master, although Bennett's brothels and gambling dens have been sealed, he has cleaned up many businesses over the years. For example, that tea house, a few gold shops, and medicine shops. Those are all valuable shops and businesses. Now that he's in jail, the gambling dens and brothels are definitely gone, but those shops and businesses, since he's already in jail and committed such a grave crime, he most likely won't be able to come out. Those businesses naturally belong to the Marquis family. The smile on Bowen's face became even brighter. He stopped in his tracks, and said to the old butler, Go and get the emergency accountant and the manpower now. We'll go and take over those shops and businesses tomorrow morning. Yes, the old butler replied, and turned to leave quickly. The heavens are really on my side. Not only did they get rid of this scourge, Bennett, they even gave me such a generous gift. Although that Meg from Mammis isn't a good person, I really have to thank him properly for this. Bowen laughed heartily. After taking over Bennett's businesses, the Marquis family's power would increase significantly, and the gap between the Morton family and the Buffett family would be shortened. It's a pity about those gambling dens and brothels. Those are the real money trees, Bowen said regretfully. He knew very well how Bennett got rich. In the City Lord's castle, the lights were still on in the secret chamber. Michael looked at Roland with a serious expression, and said, I'm not involved in the Grey Temple's internal affairs, but we still have to deal with Mammis incident properly. Although the two of them seem to have become more good-tempered recently, and have started to keep people alive, they're about to set off for the Twilight Forest. That's something that concerns the situation on the Norland continent. We have to ensure that their rear is safe. I will investigate the matter of the inspection division thoroughly. Although there's no evidence that Godalla was involved at the moment, I still transferred him to the reserve department to take on an idle position. The inspection of the various departments will also be carried out very soon. Roland drew circles on the table with his finger, and said self-reproachfully, we spent too much energy on external matters. We thought that the system would allow everything to run perfectly, but we didn't see through people's hearts. Chapter 1520. Bennett was curled up in a corner of the cell, lying on the cold floor. The wounds all over his body made it impossible for him to tell which parts were in pain and which were unharmed. However, he was already numb to all of this. His heart was as cold as his body. The fear of losing everything had even overshadowed the pain he felt physically. He had never thought that he would end up like this one day. He had only wanted to get a hot pot recipe from a small restaurant employee. However, he had lost his gambling den and brothel because of this. He had even ended up in jail. The Grey Temple knew everything. Those fellows buried in the backyard of the gambling den, the illegal potions they had sold all these years, and all the old scores had been dug up. Their testimonies were written in black and white, and he had no choice but to admit it. Those loyal and tight-lipped confidants and subordinates had all kept their mouths shut in the hands of the Grey Temple. He was afraid that he would not be able to get out. His reputation had been ruined. His brother was probably happily thinking about how to remove his name from the Marquis family's genealogy. Bennett was in a daze. He could not help but think of Meg. He was obviously the one who had caused all of this. Those employees of his, as well as his possible relationship with the Grey Temple, made him a little fearful. He even regretted it a little. If he had not been so greedy as to set his sights on Amy's, if he had not been so envious of the hot pot business, and if he had not taken action the day Meg came to visit, all of this might not have happened. Bastard! Bennett's hoarse roar reverberated in the cell. All he got in return was a stern warning. Meg had a good night's sleep. He turned off the alarm, got up, and went downstairs to make breakfast. Not long after, there was a knock on the door. Meg opened the door. Apart from Phyllis and Camilla, who had come early to prepare the ingredients, Raina was also standing at the door. Raina, why are you here so early too? Meg turned sideways to let the three of them in. He greeted Phyllis and Camilla before looking at Raina in surprise. I have something to discuss with you, so I came earlier, Raina said with a smile. She seemed to be in good spirits. All right, you can sit over there first, Meg said. Okay. Raina nodded and sat down near the door. Meg went into the kitchen and poured a cup of warm water. He gently placed it in front of Raina and looked at her with a smile. Did you sleep well last night? Yes, I slept with my mother. I slept very well. Raina nodded. All the bad guys had been caught. She had indeed slept well in her mother's arms yesterday. Is there anything you want to tell me this morning? Meg asked. Well, I have an immature idea. Raina looked at Meg with some hesitation. If you have an idea, just say it. I'm willing to listen, Meg encouraged with a smile. Raina looked at Meg's warm smile and mustered up her courage. I'm thinking, if we can set up a new hot pot restaurant outside Amy's. Open a new hot pot restaurant? Meg looked at Raina with some surprise. He thought for a while and said, based on the current situation of the restaurant, I'm afraid it won't be easy to implement. Why do you want to open another hot pot restaurant? I think hot pot is a very great invention. It has a unique cooking method and eating method, as well as a unique dining atmosphere. It also has a delicious taste. But currently, the cost of eating hot pot in our restaurant is a little too high for ordinary people. The average consumption per person is over 1,000. It's a price that most people can't accept. Raina looked at Meg and said with a sincere expression, I know that you use the best spices and ingredients to create the ultimate taste. I want to open a new affordable hot pot restaurant by lowering the standard of ingredients so that more ordinary people can taste authentic hot pot. Meg thought for a while and looked at Raina, who looked a little nervous and expectant. He nodded and said, this is a good idea. Do you have a specific plan? You agree? Raina was obviously stunned. I agree with what you said. But as for how to implement it, I still need to hear your plan. Meg didn't rush to nod. I'm very familiar with the vegetable market in the north of the city. Every day at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can buy cheap but good quality pig bones from the pig dealers. They can be used to make bone soup. Tripe and various other ingredients can also be bought fresh at the vegetable market. Through the selection of suppliers, you can obtain good quality ingredients at moderate prices. As for spices, I can find substitutes for most of them. There are some differences in taste and fragrance, but the taste is still above average. It's just that there are a few spices that I need to obtain from you. A single customer can fill their stomachs with 100 copper coins. According to my calculations, after deducting the ingredients and labor costs, there's still a profit margin of more than 50%. If there's enough customer flow every day, we should be able to reap good profits, Raina said clearly. This is indeed a very good idea. It's also very practical. Meg looked at Raina with admiration. He really didn't misjudge her back then. If Bennett successfully poached her, she would definitely be a manager and partner who far exceeded the standard. Hot pot was a favorite of the general public. Meg had never thought of putting it on the shelf at a high price. It was not compatible with hot pot at all. However, Mamis was already busy enough with all kinds of messy matters. He didn't have time to care about the feelings of ordinary people. Just as Raina said, the ingredients purchased from the system were naturally expensive because of their high quality. According to Raina's suggestion, finding a local supplier and using ordinary ingredients to make hot pot could greatly reduce the cost and make the price of hot pot more affordable. This is just an immature idea of mine. Raina blushed. She thought that her suggestion would be strictly rejected by Meg, but she didn't expect him to approve of it. Meg looked at Raina with a smile, and said, the idea is not bad. The idea of opening another hot pot restaurant to take over the middle and low-end market is very commercialized, and there's a sufficient market. However, I don't have the time to care about this at the moment. You're now in charge of the designated hot pot area. Do you still have the energy to open a new hot pot restaurant? Our restaurant only serves hot pot at night, so I'm still quite free in the morning. It's just that. Raina looked at Meg, and stopped talking. I'll give you 2 million copper coins as startup capital for the new hot pot restaurant. You'll be the manager and be in charge of all the matters of this restaurant from scratch. Our relationship isn't that of superior and subordinate, but that of a partner. I won't participate in any of the matters or decisions of this hot pot restaurant. You'll have half of the shares of this hot pot restaurant, and I'll only be in charge of the capital and future dividends. Meg looked at Raina, and said with a smile, do you have the confidence to do it? Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 1521. Half of the shares. Raina was stunned when she heard that. She quickly shook her head, and said, no way. You're the one who created the hot pot, and you're the one who invested in it. I didn't do anything, so how can I have so much of the shares? I just want ordinary people to be able to eat delicious hot pot. Letting more people taste delicious hot pot is a very beautiful idea in itself. It's also the spirit that a chef should have. Besides, how can you say that you didn't do anything? Opening a hot pot restaurant is not a simple thing. The location of the restaurant, the renovation, the selection of ingredients, the daily management of the hot pot restaurant. Everything requires a lot of effort and time. Meg smiled at Raina. To me, this is an investment of money and technology, and Raina, you're a very suitable partner. Half of the shares is the cornerstone of our cooperation, and it's also what you deserve. But Raina was still a little hesitant. I hope that your hot pot restaurant will not be limited to Chaos City. Why don't you try to make the whole world fall in love with hot pot? Meg asked Raina. Make the whole world fall in love with hot pot. Raina's eyes gradually lit up, and she felt that the world in her mind had suddenly opened up. The world outside of Chaos City was too far away for her, who used to work hard just to survive. But now, her boss had placed the whole world in front of her. Let hot pot out of Immerse, out of Chaos City, and make the whole world fall in love with hot pot. Just thinking about it made Raina's heart start to beat faster. We can plan this slowly. There's no hurry. I'll go and prepare breakfast for everyone first. Meg stood up and walked to the kitchen. He felt that Raina could grow into an excellent manager. Of course, he hoped that she could become the hot pot queen of her generation. As for him, he would become the man behind the hot pot queen. Just thinking about it made Meg feel that this was a very cost-effective angel investment. This was an almost completely empty market, and the popularity of Immerse hot pot zone had already proved the vastness of the market. Luna sat in her seat and seriously considered Meg's words. Although she felt that the conditions offered by her boss were too generous, she didn't want to lose such a life-changing opportunity. Opening a hot pot restaurant with the boss and being threatened by Bennett were two completely different feelings. There was no need to bear the infamy of being a traitor, nor did he have to go against his heart. Furthermore, they had the same goals. As a person who had dreamed of becoming a chef since childhood and serving more delicious food to customers, Raina was indeed tempted by Meg's proposal. Due to the limitations of the ingredients, the restaurant's exquisite hot pot was destined to be unable to be widely promoted. Then, how to make a down-to-earth hot pot was what she and the new hot pot restaurant had to do. If I don't do it, no one will do it. Raina turned to look at Meg, who was busy in the kitchen. Her boss was a chef who pursued perfection. Apart from the daily operations of the restaurant, he spent most of his energy on developing new products. Her boss was the most talented chef she had ever seen. The speed at which he developed new products was shocking. His bold and imaginative ideas and novel cooking methods could shake the industry every time. If someone like him wasted his energy on hot pot, it would definitely be a huge loss to the world of chefs. As for her, she liked hot pot, but she also knew that her ability was limited. To be able to specialize in hot pot and make it popular while ensuring that its taste would not be lost to the greatest extent was already a very difficult thing to do. Thinking of this, her gaze gradually became firm. After the morning operating hours, Meg had nothing to do, so he continued to teach Harris and Chapman how to make husband and wife lung slice. Chapman's husband and wife lung slice had already reached 80 to 90% of Meg's standard. He was also getting more and more familiar with the details. Meanwhile, Harris relied on his rich experience and standards that were far beyond normal chefs to bridge the gap between him and Chapman, which was created by Meg's guidance. The flavor of the husband and wife lung slice also became more and more authentic. Meg tasted the husband and wife lung slice that the two of them had just made, and curiously asked, "When are you guys planning to leave Chaos City?" Chaos City is a rather interesting place. We don't mind staying here for a while longer. Harris smiled at Meg and fawned over him. If Master doesn't mind, you can teach us a few more dishes. I have great respect for that Buddha jumps over the wall. Your hair is almost fully grown. Why are you still staring at Buddha jumps over the wall? Meg couldn't help but chuckle as he looked at the fine black hair on Harris' head. Isn't this a case of once bitten twice shy? It's one thing to grow it back, but it's another thing to prevent it from falling off. Harris chuckled. Meg rolled his eyes. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to teach Buddha jumps over the wall, but the complexity of this dish, and the stringent requirements for the ingredients, determined that it was impossible to make Buddha jumps over the wall anywhere else after leaving Meg's kitchen. As for the hair growth effect, Meg guessed that it was mostly due to one or a few of the ingredients' characteristics. If the same ingredients were grown in another place, they might not have the same effect. However, he had also benefited a lot from spending time with Harris these few days, especially in terms of cutting skills. He had learned many very practical techniques from Harris, and Harris' understanding of the ingredients' characteristics also amazed him. Mother, boss asked me to. Raina went back to the dormitory and told her mother about Meg's suggestion in the morning. Karen's thought for a while and shook her head. Mr. Mack is a good person. He just saved you yesterday, and now he wants to help you open a restaurant. He's providing the skills and money. You're just doing something, and you're getting half of the shares for no reason. We don't deserve it. Millimeter. Raina nodded. She hesitated for a while and said, but, if I don't do it, no one will be able to promote Hot Pot. Boss has more important things to do, and the others are very busy too. I really want more people to eat Hot Pot. Chaos City, and even people outside of Chaos City, can also taste the affordable Hot Pot. Karen's looked at the sparkle in Raina's eyes as if there were little suns. She smiled and nodded. Then, go ahead. Mr. Mack supports you, and so do I, boss. I've thought about it. I'm willing to be in charge of opening a new hot pot restaurant. Raina stayed behind after the lunch service. She looked at Meg, who was taking off his apron, and seriously said, but, I only want 10% of the hot pot restaurant's shares. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.